All right, everybody, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something pretty cool. It's kind of like think about it like this. You know how you explain something to like a 5-year-old, like if you're explaining how to draw like a cat or something.
Yeah,
The final drawing, everyone sees that, but like
right,
in your head, you're thinking, oh, you got to make a circle for the head, and then you need to make little triangles for the ears, and
right,
figure out how to do the tail, all that kind of stuff.
right.
Those hidden steps in your brain, those are kind of like what we're talking about today with latent thoughts.
That's a really that's a really good analogy. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it is kind of like all those underlying steps that go into creating a final product.
Exactly. And speaking of final products,
Mhm.
what do you call a lazy kangaroo?
Mhm.
A pouch potato?
Mm.
Okay, I promise no more dad jokes. But no, seriously though, these like hidden thinking steps, they're not just for us humans,
Yeah.
figuring things out. They're becoming a really big deal in how we're teaching computers how to understand and use language, especially when we don't have like mountains and mountains of, books and articles for them to learn from.
Yeah, we're running into some limitations there with how much data is actually available, and so this is a really clever way of kind of getting around that a little bit.
And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be diving into this paper called Reasoning to Learn from Latent Thoughts. And the core idea here is that, all the text that's out there, all the articles, all the websites, all the research papers, it's kind of like that finished cat drawing. It's like the compressed version of somebody's thinking. And so this paper is suggesting that we can make language models a lot smarter and a lot more efficient if we can somehow figure out those hidden thought processes that led to that text.
Right. And that's the mission for our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at how can we uncover these latent thoughts? How can we use these to make language models learn better with less information?
And this is not just some like, abstract computer science thing. This could have really real world implications. Like if you
Yeah.
could potentially make those characters in your video games, the NPCs, way more intelligent,
Yeah,
way more lifelike.
absolutely. And so to kick things off, let's start by addressing a major hurdle in the world of these large language models, and that's something called the data bottleneck.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit for everyone. So these giant language models that we hear about all the time, these things that devour, massive amounts of text to learn. It's like they're trying to build these incredibly detailed Lego cities.
Yeah.
But what if we're reaching a point where we're starting to run low on Lego bricks, or in this case, fresh human-written text for them to keep expanding and improving on?
Right. And that is exactly what's happening. The computational power that we're using to train these models is increasing at a much faster rate than the creation of new, unique text data online.
Hmm.
And so this suggests that we're quickly approaching a point where the availability of data is going to be the limiting factor in how much better these models can get.
So it's like we've read every single book in the digital library, and now these digital brains are saying, okay, well, what's next? Where do we go from here?
Exactly. And this really highlights a key difference in how we as humans learn from reading compared to how these current language models are learning.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really fascinating. So when you and I are reading something, especially like a complex research paper, right? We're not just like scanning the words. We're actually trying to figure out, why is the author saying this?
Yeah.
What's the reasoning behind this? How does this connect to what I already know? It's like we're trying to reconstruct their mental steps, almost like a detective.
Right. It's like we're decompressing all of that information, trying to understand the background knowledge that went into producing that text.
So they see the finished Lego city, but they don't get to see like the architect's plans or like the internal debate that the builders had about like where to put the skyscraper.
Exactly. And that is where this concept of reasoning to learn comes in. This is what this paper is really all about. They're proposing that we can make language model learning much more efficient if we augment that training data with these inferred, decompressed, latent thoughts.
Okay, so instead of just giving the computer a bunch more pictures of finished Lego cities, we actually try to give it some insights into how to think about building a Lego city in the first place.
Precisely, we want to try to provide the model with an approximation of the reasoning steps, the context that a human might have gone through when they were creating that text.
And so how do we even like begin to guess what those hidden thoughts are? I mean, it sounds like we're trying to read minds here.
Well, there are a number of different ways that they address this in the paper, but one of the key methods involves using other powerful language models, models that are already really good at understanding and generating text. So think of it as leveraging their advanced understanding of language to have them kind of reason backward from a piece of text and suggest the steps a human might have taken.
So we're using one smart computer to try to figure out what another smart human was thinking.
Exactly.
That's kind of wild. Can you give me like a concrete example of what these synthetic latent thoughts might look like?
Yeah, so let's imagine we have a piece of text that just states a conclusion from a mathematical proof.
Yeah.
So the original text might just say something like, therefore, x equals y.
All right.
But the synthetic latent thoughts that are generated by a larger language model could include the background knowledge, like explaining the relevant mathematical principles, definitions, and then also the logical steps that connect the initial assumptions to the final conclusion, even if those steps aren't explicitly written out in the original text.
Right. So it's like filling in the gaps. You're showing all the connections that a human reader would maybe intuitively make.
Yeah.
But a language model might just completely miss.
Exactly. And figure 3b in the paper gives a really clear example of this kind of expanded reasoning.
Okay, cool. So they didn't just come up with this idea. They actually tested it out to see if it actually helped the models learn better, right?
Right. They conducted experiments in something called a data-constrained setting, which basically means they deliberately limited the amount of training data that was available just to see if this method could actually help the models learn more efficiently with less data. And what they found was pretty amazing. They trained a relatively small language model, a tiny llama 1.1b model, and they trained it on raw data that had been augmented with these synthetic latent thoughts.
Okay.
And what they found was that it actually performs significantly better on solving math problems compared to just training on a larger amount of raw data or even paraphrased versions of the data.
Wow.
Yeah, and figure 6 in the paper really clearly demonstrates these improvements. The model that was trained with these latent thoughts showed a huge jump in its ability to solve these math problems.
So by giving the model this like behind the scenes look at the potential thinking that went into these math problems, it could actually learn more effectively with the same amount of data or even less.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And the researchers didn't stop there. They also explored this other really cool concept called bootstrapping latent thoughts, or BOLT.
Yeah.
Bootstrapping.
Yeah.
Picking yourself up by your bootstraps.
Right.
That sounds fascinating. Can you tell me more about that?
So BOLT is this iterative process. It's kind of similar to something called expectation maximization, or EM, if you're familiar with that.
Okay.
And essentially, it's like the language model gets into this positive cycle of self-improvement.
Yeah.
So in the first step, the model is trained on data that's been augmented with this initial set of synthetic latent thoughts.
Okay.
And then this slightly better model is then used to generate even better, more refined latent thoughts for the same data.
Right.
And then these improved latent thoughts are then used to train an even more capable model in the next iteration.
Okay.
So it's like the model learns to better guess the hidden thoughts, and then it uses those better guesses to then learn even better.
So it's like it starts with a rough sketch of what the reasoning might have been, and it just keeps refining that sketch over and over and over again, getting closer to a more accurate picture each time.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that the performance gains that they saw in these BOLT experiments, they came purely from the improved quality of these self-generated latent thoughts over those iterations. They didn't need to add any additional task-specific training data.
Wow.
Yeah. And figures 8 and 11 in the paper really show how the performance on these math evaluations just continued to climb with each round of this bootstrapping process.
So it's basically saying that by focusing on modeling this underlying reasoning, the models can unlock way more potential from the data that they already have without needing, a fire hose of new information all the time.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So all of this is really interesting, but what does it mean for, the things that we actually use? Like, what does it mean for those of us who like to play video games? Like, what about those characters in our games?
Right. So this is where it gets really exciting when we start thinking about applying this to large language models that power NPCs or non-player characters in video games.
Right. And so often these NPCs, they feel a little bit predictable, right? Like their responses are kind of limited. They don't always seem to, really get what the player is doing.
Right. And so for an NPC to really react in a way that feels realistic and intelligent to a player, it needs to be able to do more than just recite these pre-programmed lines.
Yeah.
It needs to understand the context of what's going on in the game. It needs to understand the player's choices, and it needs to understand the potential consequences of its actions.
Right.
It basically needs something that looks like a thought process.
Right. So this idea of training the language model that's powering this NPC with data that's been augmented with all these latent thoughts could actually be a game changer, right?
That's the idea. So by training the LLM with data that includes these inferred reasoning steps and background knowledge, the model might be able to generate these much more coherent and reasoned outputs
Yeah.
when it's used for NPC dialogue or actions.
Yeah.
So it's like we're giving the NPC's brain this much richer understanding of how information connects and how decisions are made within the game world.
So instead of just having this very small set of pre-programmed responses, the NPC might actually be able to think through a situation, understand what the player's trying to do,
Mm.
and then react in a way that feels much more natural and logical.
Exactly. And this approach could lead to NPCs that not only have more varied and sensible conversations, but also that they make more logical decisions within the game world.
Mm.
Imagine an NPC that witnesses a player stealing something.
Right.
If its underlying model has been trained with latent thoughts about like cause and effect or, social norms, it might react in a way that's much more believable. So it might alert the guards, it might refuse to trade with the player
Right.
rather than just repeating some generic greeting.
Yeah, it's like they actually have a mind of their own. It's like, hey, I saw you do that. That was bad.
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Right.
That'd be so cool. And the potential doesn't even stop at text. The researchers mention that this idea of inferring these latent processes, it's not limited to text data.
Yeah.
It could be applied to other types of data like video. So you can imagine trying to understand the hidden thoughts behind like how a filmmaker chooses to frame a scene or edit a sequence.
Yeah.
If we could model those latent processes, we might be able to, improve the models in those areas as well.
Right. It really is a very general concept, and I think it's really powerful.
Yeah. So I think the big takeaway here for everyone listening is that by trying to model this hidden thinking, this underlying why, behind the data, we can make AI models learn way more effectively and use less data. And that opens up a whole bunch of possibilities.
It does.
Everything from more efficient language models to, more intelligent, more engaging AI and all these different applications, including those video game characters that we were talking about. And that brings us to our final thought for all of you to ponder. Could this be a step towards creating AI that reasons in a much more human-like way?
That is the question.
It is the question. And, on a more personal level for all of you listening out there, it might be interesting for you to think about how this concept of hidden understanding applies to your own learning, to your own problem solving. Are there latent thoughts that you could become more aware of that would actually enhance your own understanding?
Yeah, I think that's something we're thinking about.
It is, and I think that's all the time we have for this deep dive. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you found this as fascinating as we did, and we'll see you next time.